Welcome to the fourth series in a four-part webinar on the Australian live cattle export market. In the previous webinar, we took a look at Northern Territory as a case study, focusing on regional employment and climate factors that have an impact on the live cattle export trade. In this webinar, we take a look at our export destinations offshore with a focus on Indonesia as a brief case study. Looking at our key export destinations for the 2017 period, we can see on the left-hand side diagram that Indonesia takes the lion's share of our live cattle export trade at over 500,000 head of cattle going there during the 2017 period. Indeed, over the last decade, Indonesia has taken between 45 to 55% of the market share of volumes of Australian live cattle going offshore. If we look earlier into the 2000 to 2005 period, Indonesia experienced a significant growth in their imports of Australian live cattle, such that at one stage in 2007, the level of market share of Indonesia peaked at around 80%. However, the introduction of other alternative destinations such as Vietnam and China has seen the market share of Indonesia reduce such that over the last decade, it's been around that 45 to 55%, and last year was sitting at around 50%. If we take a look at the Vietnamese situation, we see that the Vietnamese growth really began in 2010 and staged some steady growth in live cattle numbers, such that by around 2013, Vietnamese importers were taking around 20 or just over 20% of the Australian product. In recent years, the Vietnamese situation has stabilised, and in the last 5 years, Vietnam has imported around 17% of Australian live cattle in terms of market share. The situation in China has been a little bit more gradual. The level of market share for China began to increase in around 2006, and by about 2010, China were holding around 10% of the Australian live cattle export trade. The Chinese demand then plateaued at that point in time, and we've been reasonably stable in the last 5 years at around the 8% mark of the market share of Australian live cattle going to China. Now let's focus our attention on Indonesia as a brief case study. As outlined in the previous slide, Indonesia holds the lion's share of market share of cattle going out of Australia, and that's part of the reason we've decided to focus our attention on the Indonesian region for this case study. There's a few factors that we'll outline that show the reliance on wet markets that Indonesia has certainly now and then into the future, and we'll paint a bit of a picture as to why we think the reliance on wet markets will persist in Indonesia for some period of time yet to come. If we take a look at gross domestic product per capita or GDP growth per capita across a couple of the regions nearer to Australia, we can start to see the reason as to why Indonesia will continue to rely on wet markets as part of their red meat protein requirements. The chart on the left-hand side shows GDP per capita and highlights Australia and Indonesia. We can see that Australia has a much higher level of GDP per capita than that which is enjoyed in Indonesia. And certainly Indonesia has a lower level of GDP per capita than even countries such as Malaysia. Now, this isn't to say that the Indonesian economy isn't growing, it's just that the growth in population within Indonesia is far greater, and it puts a constraint on the ability for the Indonesian economy to increase the standard of living across the population, or on a gross national income basis. It's more difficult for the Indonesian economy to grow quickly enough because the population growth there is quite high. If we look at population increases from the 2000 to 2016 period, this highlights the situation that Indonesia is faced with. We can see Indonesia is outlined in the orange bubble diagram in the center of the slide. We can see that Indonesia has quite a high level of population increase, and this is making it difficult for the economy to grow at such a capacity that it can deliver increases to the standard of living across the whole of the population. The Indonesian government in recent times has stated that they are moving towards a goal of self-sufficiency, and we can see by looking at aspects of their economy as to how this is becoming a complex situation and difficult situation for the government to achieve. If we take a look at the proportion of imports going into Indonesia as a percentage of total consumption, we can see that in 2014 the Indonesian population imported around 30% of their total consumption requirements. However, in 2015 this reduced to 24%, so they were beginning to go down the path of self-sufficiency. However, the situation reversed in 2016 such that the proportion of imports to total consumption increased again to 32%, and by 2017 the level of imported product as a proportion of total consumption within Indonesia increased to 41%. So clearly they're quite a way yet from moving towards their goal of self-sufficiency, and this is one of these constraints that the government and the population of Indonesia are facing, that as the population continues to grow, they're going to find it much more difficult to be able to increase their standard of living and their level of self-sufficiency such that it can match comparative parts of the more developed world. And certainly if you compare the Indonesian situation with regards to access to electricity and cold storage and compare that to the situation with some of their more developed close neighbours such as Australia and some of the Asian neighbours to the north, we can see that Indonesia has a very different circumstance when it comes to per capita access to cold storage and electricity. Indeed, the chart on the right hand side, the cold store indices chart, gives a comparative measure on a per capita basis of the capacity to have a refrigerator in every household. And we can see that Australia, Japan and South Korea all enjoy a fairly high level of ability to have a refrigeration unit in each household, and that allows people within those countries to access cold and frozen meat product and be able to store it at home. However, the situation is quite different in Indonesia. The level of access to cold store within Indonesia is significantly lower, and that's going to act as a capacity constraint for the Indonesian population to move towards cold and frozen product. It's a key aspect as to why the reliance on wet markets within Indonesia will persist. Now, if we take a look at an alternative scenario with regards to access to cold store and the way in which then Indonesia and the population within Indonesia can move towards chilled and frozen product, let's just assume hypothetically that they did have access to enough cold store and enough electricity to be able to meet the same standard of living we enjoy in Australia. This would pose significant impact upon the level of electricity usage across the Indonesian economy. So unless the move to cold store within Indonesia was undertaken via green technologies such as solar, the size of the population and the increase in electricity usage that would be a flow-on effect of moving towards cold and frozen product would mean that as a whole economy, the Indonesian population would be consuming a far greater amount of electricity if all of the population had access to cold store like we do in Australia, like we enjoy in our country. And the level of use of power would be significant, so it would be making a big impact upon the carbon footprint of a country like Indonesia if all of the population had access to cold store and electricity like we do in Australia. Another aspect of the move away from wet markets and into cold and frozen product would flow through to an impact or a potential impact on Australian grain farmers. Within Australia, we import both milling wheat for flour, for bread and also noodle product in Indonesia, but we also import feed grain into Indonesia to go into their feedlots to feed the cattle that they're importing live from Australia. Now, if we were to see the Indonesian population move away from wet markets and move away from live export and into cold store and frozen product, the demand for feed grain from Australia into Indonesia would be significantly lower. And there's a secondary flow-on effect to the nature of what impact that would have on feed grain prices coming out of Australia. That wraps up our 4th webinar in the 4-webinar series on the live cattle export trade. We hope you enjoyed the series, and we hope to bring you future series in the next few years.